So in the last video I made a spook from a broom handle, and it kind of inspired me to do a giveaway, and I asked for people to leave in the comments their favourite pattern. So while I've had a couple of hours free this week, I've carved up the blanks, and I thought in this video I'd go through the various types of epoxy and how I use them, which is something I normally skip over in the videos. So let's get on with it. Probably the easiest way of getting hold of 5-minute epoxy is in these join syringes that I normally pick up at the DIY shop. They're not the greatest, to be honest, and I often have difficulty getting them to pump out the right amounts. The other option is to buy these larger tubs, which generally I get online, and these are normally mixed in a 1-to-1 ratio, and that's done basically by sight. This kind of seldom steers me wrong, to be honest. Epoxies are not the deadliest thing in the workshop, but you can develop an allergy to them, which can do some quite serious skin damage. So what I'm going to do is just mix these two together. Something like probably 30 seconds if I count. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi. I'll do that in my head. I'm mixing on what is an IKEA chopping board. It's plastic. The reason for that is because anything left on here I can generally peel off or scrape off later when it's cured and clean it up with some nail varnish remover, which is basically acetone. What I'm using to mix up here are children's glue spreaders, which can again be cleaned off when the resin's hardened up. So I'm going to leave that a few minutes to kind of start setting up. 5-minute epoxy, despite the name, doesn't actually cure in 5 minutes. What that 5 minutes refers to normally is the working time. Really, that's the point where it's kind of stiff. If I leave that probably another couple of minutes, it'll go pretty rigid. There's also another stage in that curing process called the tack-free or almost tack-free stage. I'm going to take my glove off here, but basically what should happen is I should be able to press, peel my finger off, and if I leave an imprint but I don't actually remove any resin on my finger, that's at the almost tack-free stage. That's really, if I was applying a second coat to it, I'd really want to put that on, because that second coat will bond to the first. If I leave it further to fully harden and cure, the chances are the next layer is not going to stick to it without actually using some sandpaper on the surface. So depending on the make and the manufacturer, that resin could take something like 24 hours to reach its full cured strength, or even longer in some cases. So the first thing in a layer build I normally use the epoxy for is to fit the hardware. And I've just measured out and I'm mixing up a little more epoxy. What I've done to prepare the body for fitting the screw eyes is drilled out with a slightly larger diameter hole, 3mm, than the 2mm tails of the screw eyes. To get the epoxy into the holes, I'm going to use a pipe bag that I've made, and I'm going to kind of spoon the mixture in. The pipe bags I normally make by cutting the corner off a press sealed bag and then folding it into thirds. I can cut off the wide end to make it neat, and also cut off the small end to make a tiny nozzle, and then add a bit of tape. So I'm going to push the nozzle kind of deep into that hole. What I'm looking to do is make sure I've actually fully filled the hole, and what should tell me that is if I press the eye in, it should push out some of the resin, telling me that it's full. I can just straighten it up while I've got time and move on to the next. So there's really a couple of reasons to seal the layer body with epoxy. First of all is to give it some waterproofing while I'm actually testing it, and then secondary to that is to bind the fibres together and give a kind of smooth finish to paint on. Sealing wise, all I do is just basically rub the layer body with some 5-minute epoxy, which literally takes less than a minute. I'm going to leave this to dry and get to that almost tack-free stage again, probably about half an hour, maybe less than that, and then come back and wipe another coat on. So if I'm testing and everything's kind of looking all right, which this one is, generally what I'll do is go back and add another coat. And there's a couple of different ways of doing that. I can wipe it on as I did before, or I can use a brush and apply a thicker coat. So to get a really smooth coat, I'm kind of almost overloading it with 5-minute epoxy. Obviously what I did was wait until the body had dried from the water, and then because the epoxy had hardened, I gave it a bit of a sand as well. And I've got this mounted in what is a flight iron vise, but I'm going to kind of keep that just turning a bit for a second until it hardens up. So resin wise for clear coating, there's quite a range available these days. I started out with Envirotex Light, which is normally used for craft, basically for embedding things or jewellery, which works quite well. But at the moment I'm using this, which is a resin used for rod building and layer coating, Katana resin. So rather than mix these on a plastic surface, I'm going to mix them in some cups. These are silicone cupcake moulds and can just be literally tipped out once the resin's cured. With all these bottles of clear coat, I tend to attach syringes so I can measure out exact quantities. I'm going to do 2 millilitres of each. The syringes I buy online in bulk, and then just drill holes in the top of the containers. Generally with clear coat resins you get a lot longer working time, so anything up to half an hour. With that extra working time, it's really worth putting in the effort to really give it a couple of minutes mixing. And make sure that all the sides of the container and the base is fully scraped. At this stage it doesn't matter really if you've got bubbles in the mix, they'll come out in a bit. So really to add a bit of bling, I'm using this mica powder, which is normally used in nail varnishes and cosmetics, but I'm literally going to take an absolute tiny amount. So I don't want it to colour the resin as much as just add a little tiny bit of sparkle, and it'll give some depth to the resin, that kind of 3D effect. So to apply it, it's just a case of brushing on a thin coat. And I've got this mounted in a turning rack, which is basically a mirror ball or disco ball motor. And at either end we've got paper clips to hold it and a swivel to help it turn at the other end. This is rotating at about 1.5 RPM. So the great thing about this rack, apart from the simplicity, is that it's rotating in front of me so I can see what I'm doing. I don't have to turn the layer in my hand and then place it on a rack. At this stage it's pretty much covered, and what I'm going to do is just wipe off any excess. I'm looking for anything that's sagging or bulging or places I've put too much resin on. Although it will self-level, it's not really going to work magic. At the moment I can see there's a bit of fluff in there, so what I'm going to do with that is just brush that back to the end. So I can see 1 or 2 bubbles there that are left in, and what I'm going to use is a little blow lamp and just literally waft it, and that should break the surface tension and pop most of the bubbles. And that looks okay. What I need to do now is really just cover that and leave it until it reaches that almost tack-free stage again, which probably, depending on the temperature here, maybe 4 or 5 hours, and I can come back and reapply the coat. So that second coat should go on a lot easier. And with a bait like this that's round, it should really be the final coat. On a flat-sided bait, maybe like a jerk bait or a glide bait, I'd probably go for 3 coats. So I'm going to finish applying this coat and then give it another go with the blow lamp before covering it up and leaving it rotating for probably the next 4 or 5 hours. After that I'll turn it off and leave it probably 2 or 3 days hanging up to fully harden up before hopefully taking it out and showing it some fish. So my layer's finished and the clear coat came out really well for this one. Sometimes there are problems, and rather than go through all the kind of faults that can occur with epoxy, I'll put a list up which you can find in the description of kind of common problems that I've had. And also some drawings and a little description for the rotating rack if you want to make one yourself. Winners wise, I'll post some links up around me somewhere. If you're one of the Patreon winners, I'll post that separately on the Patreon page. So in the next video I'm going to be getting the airbrush and the paints out and spraying up those patterns for the winners. So thanks for watching. If you're looking for further links to videos on this subject, I've included a list below.